Welcome to lecture number 1. We'll be talking a little bit about what world history is, and then also its biggest, smallest component, which is human prehistory. By that I mean biggest because it's a really long time, 14 billion years ago to about 3000 BCE, and smallest because we're only going to talk about it for one lecture. We might come back to some of the ideas, but given how much time it takes, it's a little bit weird that we spend so little time on it. Just to give you a sense of how big it is in perspective to the rest of what we study, if we're just talking about sheer number of years, Carl Sagan, the famous cosmologist, did a really interesting thing. He related basically the span of the universe to a calendar year. So, as Carl Sagan did, if we were to compare the time span of human history relative to that of the entire universe, anatomically modern humans only appear at 11:54 p.m. on New Year's Eve, the very last day of the year. They migrate out of Africa at 11:58 on New Year's Eve, the last day of the year. So we're migrating out of Africa 2 minutes before the end of the year, if you're thinking about it in terms of the entire history of the universe. And then, in terms of what we actually consider to be history, well, that's the last 16 seconds of the year. So if humans, anatomically modern humans, are really only around for, say, 6 minutes, we're only migrating out of Africa 2 minutes before the end of the year, well, 16 seconds is not a lot of time. Kind of lopsided. So we'll be trying to address that a little bit, but of course only in one chapter. To define world history, because that's a good thing to do when you're in a world history class, I'd like to throw out there that I think a good way of thinking about world history is a field that allows us to bring everything together, all histories together, rather than just focusing on specific moments in time, specific places, really drilling down deeply into certain events. That's very fun to do. I love to do it. I'm sure you love to do it too. Everybody has their moment in history that's more interesting to them than another. But that's not really what world history is about. World history is about putting together the puzzle pieces and creating a big picture. It's a relatively new field. It's actually only been around for about 30 years. Prior to that point, people generally studied Western civilization, sort of a history of Europe, or they studied U.S. history. Area studies have been around a little longer than that. For instance, African history, which I studied in graduate school more extensively than other fields, has been around since the 1960s or so. World history, 1980s. So really only about 30 years. Because it's so big and it's so different than what historians often do, which is really focus on very, very specific moments in time. World history focuses not on individual civilizations or the isolated contributions of individuals. Will we talk about individuals? Yes. Will we talk about individual civilizations? Yes. But the idea is that they're all a part of a much bigger patchwork quilt of what's happening in the world. And to add our patches, we might need to talk about some specific places and people. But really, we want the patchwork quilt. That's what we're going for. Some more specific things that it does focus on include interactions. The brilliant, really, father of world history, a guy named W.H. McNeill, he says that world history is the study of the interaction of people of diverse cultures. So this idea of people coming together, creating new things, new ideas. Big picture comparisons. A classic is Rome and China. Another classic comparison would be the gunpowder empires of the early modern period. Another classic comparison would be Tokugawa Japan and feudal Europe. So looking at these big comparisons across time and space. Exchanges, things that pass between cultures. Syncretism, which is the fusion of cultures. And we'll talk more about that actually in a couple of chapters. And then I also like to say arrows because I think it's nice and concrete. Here are some arrows. For example, this is showing you the spread of Buddhism out of India, starting in about the 3rd century BCE and then continuing on into the 8th century CE, and China even earlier than that, and Korea a little bit later. So you see the passage there of Buddhism around the world, and how not only are these places all affected by Buddhism, but they're connected, and that it passes through Southeast Asia on its way to China, very interestingly, and then it passes through Korea on its way to Japan and picks up different elements of all these cultures on its way. We'll talk much more about Buddhism later. So this is your first inquiry. For inquiries, you can do them in the moment or you can do them later after the lecture is done. I would suggest probably maybe doing it now if you're so inclined, but remember you have multiple options during a lecture to go ahead and jump in on those discussion boards. How is world history a unique field? What makes it special? And you don't want to just say what I said. I'd like you to think about why you think world history is kind of different in terms of maybe what it allows us to do, what it brings to the table. And why is it a useful mechanism for understanding our past and present? So what do you think world history might entail that helps us understand what's going on in our world right now and what's happened? Big history, you've had an introduction to already. Big history was it's an idea that really has developed just in the last decade with not just David Christian, but also the developers of the Big History Project. It's the UCs, and then also Bill Gates, as you saw in that extra article if you happen to read it. The idea is it's an even bigger than world history. It's huge. It's everything back to the Big Bang. And David Christian, when he teaches his big history class, spends many weeks on just the science. Very interdisciplinary in that regard. Includes the development of humans and their history, but all the way back to the Big Bang. So this includes astronomy, cosmology, physics, astrophysics, astrobiology, all kinds of interesting things, and weaves them into a story that sort of comes to a point at which we start to see ourselves in it. History as science is also something that we see in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was published in 1997. Another book you're familiar with from the introductory readings from week 1. Jared Diamond, for better and for worse, is accused of geographic determinism. The idea that because of people's geographies, they were going to determine to end up in a certain way. It was predetermined that they would end up in a certain way. Geographic determinism helps possibly to keep us away from ideas about why people develop in certain ways that are prejudicial, unfair, based on false claims about people's abilities or identities or anything else, and puts it all on the environment. But at the same time, it also denies people agency. It denies people a role in their own history that is perhaps as active as it very well could be. So geographic determinism is problematic, but also an important thing to remember. So geography, we can't rely exclusively on it, but we can use it to help us understand the past in conjunction with many other factors. So before we get started, I'd like to give an example of something utterly fascinating that is definitely not part of human history, but if we extend our definition a little bit of what human history might include, if we think about human history in more of a big history kind of way, maybe it does relate. This is Wadi Hatan, or the Valley of the Whales in Egypt. It's a picture of the skeleton of a Bilosaurus, which is an animal that lived 37 million years ago. It was about 50 feet long. There are thousands of these skeletons in this open-air monument in Egypt. It's just in the middle of the desert. This had been a lake, a shallow lake, or a shallow sea, I should say, 37 million years ago. And as it dried up, the whales that had died in this lake and whose bones had fallen to the bottom were gradually more and more and more exposed to not water. And now you can see these bones. And people can even go camping here. So these whale skeletons, people were looking at them, they thought, wow, okay, yeah, interesting, sort of really old whales, lots to tell us here. But it wasn't until somebody decided that because of new finds that were showing how whales might be connected to humans, and we know that they are because they're mammals on some level, there were some new finds in the 1970s that prompted an anthropologist to take a little bit of a closer look at these skeletons. And what he found was that they had leg bones and feet about the size of a human 3-year-old's legs attached to their bodies. These whales had legs and feet on the outside. They worked. These legs and feet worked. Now, remember that these whales are 50 feet long and totally aquatic, so when I say they worked, that doesn't mean that they actually helped them go anywhere, but they had legs and feet. When they discovered this, when they discovered these tiny little toes attached to these giant whale skeletons, it really helped people to see the fact that it wasn't just this big impenetrable mystery that could never be solved, how whales were mammals and in the water and yet related to humans who were on land, and it was an aha moment where they saw that in fact people and this very ancient mammal were more connected, and then follows that humans and whales today are more connected, perhaps, than we did feel. Thinking about this as part of our human history feels a little removed. I'll admit it. Mostly I just really like whales with feet. But I do think that it's an example of how big history can enlighten us to elements of ourselves and our place in the world that we may not otherwise have really thought to consider, in that light at least. Human evolution is generally considered a part of world history. Strayer doesn't actually talk about it, but I think he mentions it. It's kind of a choice. Different world historians start at different places. This right over here is Lucy. Let me see here. This is Lucy. No, okay. It's still not going. Pen. There we go. This is Lucy. Lucy is Australopithecus afarensis, and she was a very important archaeological find about 50 years ago. She lived about 4 million years ago and was named after a Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, as they were partying after they found her. It was the song they were listening to. And she, kind of like these whales, represented a big aha moment. Since then, there have been so many more discoveries of early hominids in Africa and elsewhere. And there's been just an enormous surge forward in terms of our understanding of how genetics work. And in particular, we have learned through mapping our genes and the genes of chimpanzees, who are our closest living relatives, that what we thought for a long time was a divergence about 7 million years ago is actually more like 12 to 13 million years ago. This is just research that's come out in the last 2 years or so. It's looking like we thought that human genes and chimpanzee genes mutated quite a bit faster than they actually do. So still, there was some common ancestor 12 to 13 million years ago that was gradually starting to diverge into different species. And these different species, one of them led down the line to Australopithecus, for instance, Homo habilis, slightly contested, Homo erectus, certainly, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens, which is us. Homo sapiens appear to have undergone a dramatic transformation between about 35 and 40,000 years ago. Many, including Jared Diamond, have attributed this to either some sort of brain change, some sort of functioning in the brain that started to work much more efficiently, or possibly command of language, which we maybe didn't have before then. There have been a lot of questions about this because a lot of this research is based on developments that we see very clearly in the archaeological record in Europe. But if you look in different places in Africa, in Asia, and stop focusing so much on Europe, you actually see a lot of very advanced tool making, very similar sorts of cultural advances taking place 70,000, 80,000, 90,000 years ago to what we see happening in Europe 35 to 40,000 years ago. In any case, it is very fair to say that after millions of years of evolution, in a very short period of time, relatively, just like I was talking about at the beginning of the lecture, you know, those 2 minutes or so, we, at the end of the year, we see a very, very rapid progression from an animal, essentially, to us. We are still animals. It's obviously a little bit different. The reason we're a little bit different from most other animals is that we walk on 2 feet. That is bipedalism. We have a larger brain, and that's relative to our size, our body size. It's part of the reason why it's so hard to have babies, actually, for women, and why those babies are so undeveloped. If you watch a baby deer being born from a mama deer, it just kind of comes right out and then is running around a few minutes later. Because humans are so small relative to the size of their brains and their skulls, we have very, very helpless infants and a very dangerous birth process. The other thing that makes us different is our voice box. So we have an ability to make language that very, very few other species on Earth have. Animals do communicate very clearly. There are many different kinds of monkeys that make very specific calls. There are certainly so many things we don't understand about whale communication underwater. There are many birds that can mimic human speech. Chimpanzees have been taught to sign and definitely can understand language, but they can't speak. So this is something, though, that at least among among non-parrots is quite unique to humans, is being able to speak and to do so in relatively complex ways. This is an interesting video about evolution, and particularly Jane Goodall's role in helping us understand our connection to the animal kingdom. And I'll talk about it in a second after it's done.
In the back of my mind, I'd nursed the notion that we humans had somehow taken the wrong turn. It seemed that the chimpanzees were much kinder and more gentle than we were. Therefore, I was totally unprepared for what happened next. The brothers, Hugh and Charlie, my old friend Goliath, all gone. My Garden of Eden, almost overnight, had become a very, very dark forest indeed. They were more like us than I could ever possibly have imagined.
What Jane had witnessed was all-out war between Fifi's community and a splinter group to the south. By the time it was over, the entire southern population had been annihilated.
I've seen so much here at Gombe. Political intrigue, cruelty, war, but also love, compassion, and even humor. Over the years, the perceived gap between humans and chimpanzees has become smaller and smaller. Every time I think I understand chimpanzee behavior, they do something that takes me completely by surprise.
What Jane encountered almost by accident turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in the history of biology.
I was walking through the forest when I spotted a hunched figure through the vegetation. He had his back to me, but I could see him stripping the leaves off a small twig, then busying himself around the top of a termite mound. I could see him pushing the twig into a hole in the mound. I had no idea what he was up to, but then he pulled out the twig and expertly picked a few termites off it with his lips. I was mesmerized. I knew that what he had just done was considered at the time to be outright impossible. A mere non-human had just fabricated a clever and effective tool right before my very eyes.
When Jane first described termite fishing, the ability to make and use tools was considered one of the defining features that set humans apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. We were known as man the tool maker. In what has become a famous quote, Dr. Louis Leakey wrote to Jane that now we will have to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans.
I've since discovered that all the Gombe chimpanzees know how to termite fish. Predictably, Titan doesn't have the patience to stick with it for long. The chimpanzees have even figured out a way to fish for the vicious army ants. I've been bitten by these ants, and it is a really painful experience. And yet, even a little chimp like Gaia is an expert when it comes to fishing for them, something she learned from her mother, Gremlin. What's so fascinating about all of this is that this technique of ant fishing is unique to the Gombe chimpanzees, a learned behavior passed down from parents to children. This is not instinctive. This is culture, in the true sense of the word, knowledge that flows from one generation to the next.
Every chimpanzee community has a unique set of traditional behaviors. Some are practical, others are simply rituals, the meaning of which we can only guess. Following in Jane's footsteps, researchers have studied groups of chimpanzees all across Africa, and they have discovered a whole range of culturally distinct behaviors. At Gombe, males sometimes grab a branch above their heads while grooming. 100 miles further south, males clasp hands instead of grasping a branch. Each group has adopted its own version of this grooming ritual. The calls of chimpanzees within a community are distinct from other communities. They seem to imitate each other to create a group dialect. In some parts of Africa, chimpanzees use specific plants to cleanse themselves of parasites in a form of self-medication. In West Africa, chimpanzees use logs to break open palm nuts. This behavior has never been seen elsewhere in Africa.
So I think this clip is pretty wonderful for showing just how far we've come in the last 50 years or so in understanding our connection to the natural world, to our genetic ancestry, and also maybe a willingness to see our own history as being part of a much larger process of development. It's also very important to note that everybody used to see tool use and the manipulation of environment as being so important in defining what was human and separating it from what was not human. It's very interesting to note that this manipulation of the environment is not seen anymore as being exclusively human, and also not necessarily seen as a good thing. Man's tool use over time has brought us to a place where we're pretty capable of destroying our planet. This is also, in line with the designation of the era that we now live in as the Anthropocene, which starts either with the Industrial Revolution or the Nuclear Age. This idea that we've developed so quickly that humans are now actually the major force in the world in terms of the environment and what happens to it. And that's because of our tools. So, inquiry number 2. How much of our history lies within the realm of science? And should we really think of history and science as separate realms? When does human history technically begin? And does it help us or hurt us to make these kinds of distinctions between history and science, and what constitutes human history and what doesn't constitute human history? We love to define things in academia as being separate from each other. We love to draw lines in the sand and say, this topic is the purview of this discipline, and this topic is the purview of this discipline. But in a lot of ways, they are all related, and they're all, again, part of that patchwork quilt. At the same time, sometimes they need to be separate. So, if you want to go ahead and answer inquiry number 2, feel free to take the time to do so now, or you can come back and do it later. Human prehistory. So now we're going to embark on sort of a more standard place to embark, even though, again, everybody does it at different places. We need to define what we mean by prehistory. Prehistory generally means before writing, which means we don't have documents to work off of. We generally just have anthropological evidence, meaning the study of cultures, the study of remains, and in fact, anthropology includes archaeology, which is where many of us go when we want to think about the evidence that we can use to determine what went on in the past, particularly before writing. So this is, again, back to the biggest, smallest part of world history. The Paleolithic is huge, comprises the vast majority of human history, and yet we barely even study it. Why is that? And you know, it's a useful thing to think about. Why should that be? Why should that not be? Now, to define these two terms, Paleolithic and Neolithic. Let's see here. Oh, my little pen went away. Paleolithic starts, generally speaking, 2.6 million years ago. That's with the first material evidence of human technology. So going back to what they were just saying in the last video, this idea that humans could make tools. In fact, they cite this as an example of an early Paleolithic tool. It is, in fact, it's just a stone that shows evidence of hammering. So they were using this stone to hammer other things, which looked just like what the chimpanzees were doing in that last clip with logs. So kind of interesting, and some chimpanzees do use stones. So this is from about 1.6 million years ago. Right here, it was found in China. Other much more sophisticated looking tools that certainly no other animal in the world produces are things like this projectile point right here, which was found 100,000 years ago in Ethiopia. Also part of the Paleolithic period, towards the end, are things like needles, very fine, small, carefully crafted items that show a real skill. Now, these are all Paleolithic items, and we'll see some later on in the lecture too. These two over here are Neolithic items. Neolithic refers to basically when agriculture begins in the Middle East, which is around 8,000 BCE, or about 10,000 years ago. Different places stayed on as Paleolithic past 8,000 BCE because they did not yet have agriculture. So we can say that this begins the Neolithic period of human history, but it's really just limited to the Middle East. And the Neolithic period continues through till when we see the development of civilization, which is a problematic word in and of itself that we'll discuss much more in the next chapter. But generally speaking, this means writing, cities, sedentary civilizations. This right here is the axe of the Iceman Utsi, a, a man, a Neolithic man who lived in the Alps, in Italy actually, and who was probably killed and died in the hilltops and was preserved for about 5,000 years. And this is his copper axe that he had with him that would have been a sign of a fairly high social status, actually. And then this over here is a knife that was found in Çatalhöyük, which is a Neolithic civilization that we'll talk about towards the end of this lecture. This right here is an animal, probably a boar's head, or a boar carved out of bone as the handle for the knife blade. This is probably obsidian. Anyway, just giving you a sense of the different kinds of developments of tools that we have, since that's what people focused on for so long as defining human, or what was human. Last quick little note, Paleolithic. Lith means stone, paleo means old, old Stone Age. Neolithic, neo means new, again lith means stone, new Stone Age. So this right here is a picture of Paleolithic people. Now, these are not anatomically modern humans. This would have been Homo erectus, actually. This is a group of people whose remains and the remains of their camp especially have been found near a German town of Bilzingsleben in central Germany. And it's an interesting rendering. For instance, a lot of these bones would have actually been the bones of things like the European rhinoceros and the European elephant, because such things existed back before mankind killed them all off. And you see here proximity to water, very important. You see the building of shelter. You see the use of fire, really important. You see the construction of clothing, of warmth here. You see the use of animals for a variety of different things. You see some weapons here. You see definitely a very clear coexistence with nature. You see a bear skin drying out back here, making more leather. You see evidence of weaving. So there's all kinds of interesting things going on in this picture that are very useful for thinking about not just anatomically modern humans, but in fact even our predecessors who are not considered to be our same species. Now this right here is a map from National Geographic showing when humans migrate out of Africa. Anatomically modern humans. This is actually where Strayer begins his book. So we have the African cradle. Most paleoanthropologists and geneticists believe that humans evolved or arose about 200,000 years ago in Africa. In particular, they look at sites in South Africa, where we have lots and lots and lots of fossils, actually, and there have been some really interesting finds lately. And then also in here in East Africa, where in fact the oldest bones have been found of early modern fossils. Right now the oldest are here in Ethiopia at Omo Kibish. Sites in Israel, up a little higher than that, over here, hold the earliest evidence of humans outside of Africa. But interestingly, this group appears to have died out. And in fact, it took a little while longer for other groups to then cross over either here at the bottom of the Red Sea or here at the top of the Red Sea and start to populate the Middle East and then out this way. So about 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, we start to see larger groups of early humans leaving Africa, settling in the Middle East, and then spreading all the way over here. Now, this makes sense in terms of the climate and in terms of areas that people would have known how to live in. This is a much more temperate zone. It would have been much more similar to what they knew over here. So even though it seems like kind of a long way to go down to Australia, that was in fact where they went. A little later than that, they went to Asia, and even a little bit later than that to Europe. This came along with that giant jump I was referring to earlier, where humans all of a sudden seemed able to do things that were much more advanced in terms of their technology and in terms of their culture as a whole. Now, the last wave, this is an interesting map projection. This is humans coming across the Bering Strait down into North America. Lots of unexplained sites here in America, to be honest. So we think that 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, humans were crossing over the Bering Strait because that's when it would have made sense. There are sites, however, all the way down here in Chile that are dating pretty incontrovertibly back to 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. So it's not that this hypothesis doesn't work. It does. It definitely could have happened this way. But a slow migration by foot may not have been the only way that the Americas were populated. It may have also been that people had boats, because they definitely had boats. They were pretty incredible seafarers, as you can see from their going down to Australia here. And they could have been sort of hopping along the coastline all the way down to Chile, which is another hypothesis that's out there. These in particular, these sites are a little hard to explain because they're all the way across. Some theories that are becoming a little bit more well known lately are theories that say that perhaps Europeans were coming over and also simultaneously populating the east coast of the United States. Most of those theories are pretty controversial, although there are some archaeologists and anthropologists who find that to be a viable explanation for some of these sites on the east coast of the United States that are otherwise a little bit more difficult to explain. As Americans, as these new Americans, I guess, who will eventually become the Native Americans, progressed into the Americas, they found all kinds of animals that would be very, very, very strange to us now if we were to encounter them. And they killed them, all of them. There was a huge extinction in the Americas that came around 12,000 years ago. And a lot of that had to do not only with humans, and it's pretty clear that humans were responsible for most of this die-off, but also with a major shift in climate that began to take place, that really coincided actually with the Neolithic era. As that happened, animals like the giant beaver, shown here, which was 9 feet long, and there were many of these, became quickly extinct. The American horse and camel became extinct. And very interestingly, horses and camels are native to the Americas. That's where they evolved. And then they spread backwards into Asia, if we want to think about this in human terms, across the Bering Strait. And those are the horses and camels that managed to live on after all of the horses and camels in the Americas died off, which was actually a process that took place for the most part before humans arrived. So, interestingly, though, these species were in the Americas long before they were in Europe. The giant short-faced bear, I don't know what this woman in a sort of what the scantily clad woman is doing in this picture, but I do like that she shows you the relative size of humans compared to some of the animals. This is why we call them megafauna that were running around at this time. This is a skeleton of a giant short-faced bear. America also had lions, American lions, and saber-toothed tigers, and giant sloths, and all sorts of fascinating animals. A great place to see them is the La Brea Tar Pits in in LA. So animals were extremely important to humans and made up most of their focus in both sort of practical contexts, like needing to eat and needing to be clothed, and also spiritual contexts. Culturally, animals were extremely important to human beings. And this is very true in the Paleolithic era. And I believe says a lot about humans' relationship with nature at this point in time. There's a fantastic film that came out in 2010 by Werner Herzog, a German filmmaker, called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is about the Chauvet Cave in France. There are, in fact, signs that humans were there, even though just about everything is pictures of animals, which is very similar actually to the Lascaux caves in France, which are much more famous and about, I don't know, 16,000 years younger. But the major sign is a human handprint of one, I guess, artist who left his handprint all over the cave. And what's very interesting about this handprint is that it has a pinky that's just a little bit bent. And it's got such a human element to it, to think about this painter going through this cave and making his mark with his hand. Given the relative lack of human presence compared with animal, though, it shows you, though, how insignificant they must have thought that humans were relative to these animals. And in fact, there were shrines in the cave, or apparent shrines, that had things like bear skulls laid on top of them. And it again gives you a sense of the way humans must have felt about their environments during the Paleolithic era. So inquiry number 3 is, in what ways has the environment affected human development and human history in general? And how have humans historically affected their environments? Speaking specifically to this period, at least, if you're going to answer this question. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about early human social organization. Strayer does a nice job with this in the chapter, but I'll reiterate some things here. We have small groups of hunter-gatherers, probably 30 to 50 people at a time. Family-based clans, and in general, 2-parent families. Very difficult for these people to raise a kid when there's only one parent. So generally speaking, in order for that genetic offspring to survive, both parents had to be involved. One had to get food, one had to stay with the kid. There was relative equality between the sexes, it appears. And it's not just from talking to people today who live in societies that are primarily hunting and gathering, as with the account from Nisa, which you'll read about in the documents for this chapter. It's actually clear from a number of different archaeological pieces of evidence, including these Venus figurines, which we'll talk about in just a second, that show the prominence of women's reproductive features especially, but also show that women were at least had access to things like woven materials, and probably finely woven materials. They were seen as being basically worthy of worship for their reproductive capacities. And we know from their grave goods, they were buried with grave goods that were very similar to men that they were they lived in the same societies with. The other thing that's kind of interesting about these groups is that there was clearly division of labor. Women were in general responsible for weaving and textile production, even though men might also have taken part in that somewhat. But generally speaking, it was almost certainly women. And we also know that men were hunting and the women were gathering. Strayer makes some good points about the fact that that was not necessarily even a 50-50 divide. In fact, the meat that the men brought home was less of the overall diet than what the women were bringing, but they were both necessary components of the diet for people to be healthy. They generally only worked about 3 days a week to produce this food, so life wasn't sort of terribly precarious, but at the same time, life expectancy was low, and as Strayer does a good job of documenting, there was definitely a lot of violence in these societies, which we see in the archaeological record. This is another interesting depiction of the division of labor. These cave paintings are from Tazili Niger National Park in Algeria. It's basically an oasis, not sort of the palm trees and giant watery goodness kind of oasis that you might be thinking about. Just something that's barely livable in the middle of the Sahara, and has always been barely livable in the middle of the Sahara. But this area right here this painting here is clearly showing women picking grain. I don't know why they have their legs out behind them. It's a little singular, but they were clearly collecting grain. Excuse me. And men were seen to be herding cattle. At this point, animals had been domesticated, so this is actually starting to verge into the Neolithic period. But these are clearly ways in which those early gender divisions among hunting and gathering communities morphed ultimately into similar gender divisions in early agriculture. This national park, by the way, has something like 15,000 of these rock engravings in cave paintings. And even though the area has become more and more of a desert, it's still inhabited by the Tuareg. So, primarily in Europe, we have lots of Venus figurines, as we call them. The oldest that has been found is from about the same time as the Chauvet Caves. This is the Venus of Hohlfels from Germany, and it's made out of bone. It's probably, it's small enough to fit in your hand, so it's not a large item, but it's interesting. It's not sort of fully intact, or at least the human body that it's meant to depict is not fully intact. This is the head, kind of. The legs aren't really all there. The major focus here is on the reproductive parts of this woman's body. This right here is a ceramic Venus figurine from the Czech Republic. This is the oldest ceramic object of any type. And then this is another Venus figurine from Italy about 20,000 years ago. And these really are just everywhere, indicating again that at least gender equality was prevalent, if not a valuing of women that may in fact have surpassed a valuing of men, particularly for spiritual and reproductive reasons. So what surprises you or strikes you about early gender and social structures? What do you make of the evidence that we use to give us clues to these aspects of the past? So we don't have writing yet, remember. We only have these archaeological items. What's good about that? What's less good about that? Now, on to the agricultural revolution, which, as I said, begins in the Middle East around 8000 BCE. Agriculture and Neolithic are the same thing. It's also interesting because it occurs alongside the warming of the Earth. So this is, we've heard of the Ice Age. This is the Earth coming out of the last Ice Age. And along with that comes desertification, in fact. So people are having to find new ways of getting food, because not only are their old ways of getting food not going to be as useful in a much warmer climate, they're also needing to find ways to feed more people, as some of their land that they'd previously used for hunting and gathering became deserts. This is actually why so many people end up in Egypt, because the Sahara didn't actually used to be the desert that it is today. In fact, it used to be somewhat livable, as you could see from some of those paintings, those cave paintings in Algeria. We see agriculture developing at the same time as pastoralism, and pastoralism is a really important word to be familiar with. It means basically people who worked with animals that could be put to pasture. Sheep, goats, horses, cows are the main ones. And these people were not necessarily sedentary. Pastoralists are very, very important contributors to the human story, but they tended to be nomadic, and they tended not to build things like cities in ways that were easily recordable. There were several different centers of origin of agriculture and pastoralism. Middle East is first, around 8000 BCE. China comes next, a couple thousand years after that, particularly north and south. Whether or not this was an independent invention or if it was diffused from the Middle East is unclear. Oceania came next, places like New Guinea, not Australia. Australia never took up farming until the 18th century, when Europeans brought it over. Africa came next, particularly West Africa, then the Americas, Mesoamerica first, then South America, then North America, and all different kinds of crops as well. And we'll talk much more about this next week as well. So you see here, Southwest Asia is first. Here are more of my arrows, by the way. Southwest Asia, we see the domestication of wheat and barley in particular, and then also the domestication of cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. East Asia, you see the domestication of millet and rice and wheat and barley and soybeans and mulberry and sorghum. And then the development, or the domestication of pigs and chickens, also very important. Southeast Asia domesticates bananas, extremely nutritious, yams, peas, rice, and domesticates pigs, oxen, and chickens. Those bananas, by the way, are taken over to Madagascar by enterprising expert sailors from Southeast Asia and are then introduced into Africa via Madagascar. West Africa domesticates yams and sorghum and begins to spread out those crops, as they're also coming in this way and this way into Africa. And then over here in Mesoamerica, we see the domestication of maize, beans, and squash, and that ultimately spreads up and down, where we see more of the three sisters, as they're called, maize, beans, and squash, but also potatoes and tomatoes, and the domestication of the only large animal of the Americas, the llama and the alpaca. Africa has no domesticable animals that it does not import, ultimately, from Eurasia, including cows, like we saw in that last cave painting. Impacts of agriculture are, as you might imagine, great. They are, agriculture has a tremendous impact on the environment. So at first people are starting with semi-cultivation, particularly women, basically early horticulture, gardens, while men are out hunting. And that leads to more intentional cultivation. Then it leads to slash and burn, meaning you burn down areas of forest or bush or whatever, and clear land for your garden or for your crop. But then also you can use slash and burn to just try to sort of dislodge seeds and get them into the ground. Either way, this has a major environmental impact on biodiversity. Firstly, the major and successful plants and animals now become those that are useful to humans. And those who are not useful to humans are eradicated and become extinct. It begins a massive process of deforestation as well, and desertification. We see the erosion of grassland by nomadic pastoralists who increasingly have more and more animals that take more and more of a toll on ecology or local ecosystems. Evidence of social stratification. So we start to see more and more social stratification as people get wealthier. We see specialization as fewer people have to work. And ultimately we see the development of civilization, which will all be topics for next week. Other more general impacts are that populations increase at the same time as we see a decline in health. A lot of this has to do with the fact that people are living in closer contact with each other and in these larger populations, and disease spreads as you come into more and more contact with animal populations. Also, people aren't eating food that is as healthy as what they had been eating before. They're getting less exercise, they're more sedentary. So it's interesting. It doesn't actually have a huge impact on lifespan. So one last little look here at a Neolithic settlement before we finish up. This is the village of, or the town, if you want to think about it that way, of Çatalhöyük. That's how it's pronounced. It's in modern day Turkey, in the southern part of Turkey down here. And this was a place that was thriving between about 7,500 to 5,000 BCE. This is very much right in the middle of the Neolithic period, so we wouldn't necessarily consider Çatalhöyük a civilization. We would consider them to be something pre-civilization, mostly because they don't have writing. It is the best preserved Neolithic site in the world. It was very wealthy. Primarily because of its trade, especially in obsidian. It's near a volcano. There were about 5,000 people who lived here. And if you look at their little layout, they didn't have streets. In fact, what they did was they constructed their buildings on top of each other in kind of a honeycomb. And what they would do is they would, as people died or as people's dwellings sort of became less and less habitable, basically fill them up and then continue to build upwards. They buried their dead inside their homes. They generally all had 3 rooms per family, and one of them would be a shrine room, completely devoted to religious worship, and ultimately a place where the dead would be buried. Interestingly, when important people died, this is just kind of a fun fact, they would separate the head from the body. And going back to this idea that Neolithic peoples were more egalitarian, we also see more examples of women in their, as being sort of worshipped for their reproductive capacities, as well as the fact that we see male and female religious motifs in shrine rooms, and, as I said before, lots of this separation of the skull from the body when important people were buried, and many of those bodies that had separated skulls were actually women's bodies. So, lastly, and this is a place where you could definitely use the Göbekli Tepe reading. I highly encourage you to look at that before you answer this, if you choose to answer this. What led to the development of agriculture? Why did nomadic people settle down? And what were the consequences of this development? These questions are extremely important and basically lay the foundation for the world as we know it today. While there are elements of the distant past that may seem familiar to us, in general, obviously, our day-to-day experiences don't really seem like that of nomadic hunting and gathering peoples. What has changed? What has improved? What hasn't improved? Well, I'm actually going to be asking you this question pretty directly in your first essay, which I'll assign next week. But even if you don't necessarily want to come down too hard on one side or the other here, I do encourage you to think about history in a way that allows you to think critically about the world that we do live in and why we make some of the decisions that we make. I think Strayer does a lovely job of saying this in his last reflections, the 2 pages at the end of the chapter where he talks about objectivity. We can never be fully objective. We're human. We are subjective. The best we can do is try to be objective in the way that we accumulate our information, in the way that we disseminate information when it's meant to be informative. But we can also allow ourselves to make judgment about that information and use it in order to improve our world. So, with that said, I appreciate your attention and feel free to go ahead and start working on those responses on the discussion board. Thank you so much.